Hey guys, it's Courtney and I am back with day number 3 using the Simon Says Stamp September 2018 card kit. I am starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I used the Simon Says Stamp Stitch Rectangle die. This is the second to largest rectangle. And I'm stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink, and we're going to be creating a very simple scene with no masking at all. So I started by stamping that little treasure chest, and then we'll move on to the stamps with like the coral and the different plants and seaweed and whatever else these things are called. And I'm just basically lining these up on the bottom portion of my card panel. I'm not worried about masking them. I'm just trying to not really overlap them too much. I worked right from one edge to the other, and once all of my images were stamped here, I did go back and add 2 of the little fish. And these are actually the same type of fish, but one's a little bit larger than the other, and they're facing in opposite directions. So I just used those to fill in some of the areas on the top portion of my card panel. Then we will move on to adding the distress ink to the background. Again, I didn't mask these. I'm using very light colors here, so I planned on coloring directly over them. I'll be using regular distress ink in the color Antique Linen, and I'll be using the Distress Oxide in Tumbled Glass. This is from the card kit. I started off with the Antique Linen, and I'll be going from the bottom part of the card and kind of working my way up, not going all that far, maybe a third of the way. Then I'll move on to the Tumbled Glass and work from the bottom, or I'm sorry, from the top to the bottom where that Antique Linen stops. Now you can interchange the Distress Oxides and regular Distress Inks. They still will blend pretty well together. Next, we'll move on to the Copic coloring. I'll start with the little treasure chest here, and I'll be using my E50 markers for the main part of the chest. And I'm just kind of going over the entire area with my lightest color here. Then I'll move on to my darkest, which is the E59, and just mapping out my darkest areas. This will be kind of on the lid, I guess, or the top part of the treasure chest. I'm just basically putting a very thin line with the tip of my marker barely touching the paper. Then for the bottom part, the darkest area will be off to the left, just because of the way the treasure chest is kind of facing here. And then I'll move on to my mid-tone colors and just extend those out a little bit. Some of these areas are pretty small, so don't worry about that flicking motion that we normally do. You might want to just put a very small line, extending that line that we made with the E59 just a little bit further. My lightest mid-tone, I'm basically doing the same thing. Now there are parts of this treasure chest that you might not even have room for the highlight color, which is fine. The larger areas you do want to preserve that highlight color. So for the bottom part, I will go in and add that E53. Next, for the, I don't know what this would be called, I guess the border, maybe? I want to make this kind of like a golden color. So I'm starting with my my E37, which is a brown, but then I will move on to the golden color here and going directly over that E37, and then just extending that out a little bit. And then finally going over the entire thing with kind of like a yellowish color to brighten that up a little bit. For the gold coins, I guess they would be, inside the treasure chest, I'm not doing any kind of shading here. I'm just going to go over them with one solid color. I'm going to be adding a whole lot of sparkle to these later, so I'm not really worrying about shading at this point. Next, we will move on to these little plants here. So I'm going to be using a variety of greens mostly. For this little seaweed looking plant, I'm going over with my lightest color over the entire thing, then moving on to the darkest color, just concentrating the darkest areas being right there in the center towards the bottom of each little plant, and then creating a shadow for where these plants kind of lie over one another. Then extending those out with my mid-tone, preserving my highlight on either side of the plant so that I don't have two darkest areas touching. And then I'll cover the entire area with my lightest color again. For my next little plant here, these are really teeny tiny areas. You could get away with just one color here. In fact, the two colors that I chose are very similar to one another because I knew I didn't have a whole lot of room to blend. So I went in with my lightest color, and then I'll just add little flicks here and there of my darkest color, and then go back in with the lightest color to blend that out just a little bit. You don't want to over blend here. You don't have a whole lot of room to work with. And next, I'll move on to these little plants over to the right, going over with my lightest color again. Now my darkest areas, these are kind of like wavy. So where they're kind of indented into itself, I'm adding just a little bit of flick of my darkest color just to give that the dimension that the image shows. And then I'll move on to my mid-tone and extend those little flicks where it's indented out just a little bit. Then going back in with my lightest color again and covering up the entire area and blending that out. Next, for this corally looking plant, again, this is not a whole lot of room to work in, so you don't want to overblend. In fact, you could probably go in with your darkest color first, but I am going to go in with my lightest color and just basically cover up those entire areas, and then I'll move on to the darkest color. And my darkest area for this one, I decided would just be from the bottom coming up, and I just stopped basically wherever I felt like it. And then I'll go back in with the lightest color and just blend that out just a little bit. Again, I chose colors that were pretty similar to one another because I didn't have a whole lot of room to work with. Next, we will move on to the little fish here. And I'm going to color two of these little areas with my BG markers, going over the entire little stripe there with my BG11, then adding a little bit of shading to the bottom with the BG13, flicking up a little bit, and then blending that back out with my BG11. For the other little stripes, I'm using my R80 markers, doing the same thing, covering the entire area with my lightest color, the R81, flicking up a little bit from the bottom with the R85, and then blending that out with the R81 again. Now, even though we added this antique linen distress ink towards the bottom of the card, I wanted to add a little bit of interest, especially with those images that have the little hills of sand, I guess, underneath them. So I'm going in with my E30 markers, and I'm taking my darkest, the E37, and just darkening those areas up a little bit that are part of the image, these little hills, I guess. Just basically going over the image itself. Then I will blend that out with my E33, taking that down just a little bit further than my E37. Then I'll add just a little bit, a few little dots here and there just to give the area a little bit of interest. Go back in with my E31, extend that out even further towards the bottom of the card. And again, I'm just going right over these plants. It's a light color, so you don't really have to worry about that. and then extending that up with the E30, which is the lightest color. Next, the fish kind of lost their black outline because I used the Distress Oxides on top. They're opaque, so they're going to take away some of that black line. So I'm just going in with the EK Success journaling pen and just outlining those fish. I didn't worry about the rest of the images. Next, for my sentiment, I'm going to be using the embossing ink that came in the kit and also the embossing powder that came in the kit. And I use my anti-static tool, especially because we did use Distress Oxides on the top. We don't want any stray embossing powder to stick to areas other than the sentiment itself. I'll go ahead and heat set that, and then we'll add a little bit of detail to our little images. I used a white gel pen to add a little bit of a reflection to the treasure chest itself, as well as the little fish above it. Then we'll go in with a Nuvo sparkle pen, and we'll add a whole lot of shimmer to these little gold coins. Now these sparkle pens, whether it be a Nuvo or a Wink of Stella, they dry super fast, but the more layers you add, the more sparkle you'll get. So I added a layer of sparkle to these little gold coins, and then I'll go back in and add even more. I did add a little bit of sparkle to that border of the treasure chest as well, but I just did one layer to kind of differentiate between the two. Next, I took a piece of the tonic paper that came in the kit, which I'm kind of obsessed with. It's gorgeous. And I'm using my Tombow Mono multi-glue to go ahead and adhere that flat to an A2 size card base. Now this is really thin. It's not cardstock really. So that's why I'm using my liquid glue. I just think I have better luck with having that stick flat. Then I'll take a piece of fun foam for my main panel here, and I'll also use the same Tombow Mono multi-glue to stick that directly onto that tonic paper. And I usually put this under something heavy once I have this adhered to the spot that I want it to be, just to make sure everything dries flat. And that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.